welcome to this, what we're going to classify as a mini VR writer's room today, because we approximately have about half an hour. So, Bertie, where have you gone? I'm looking at you to do timekeeping and wave at me when we're at half an hour, because this lot will keep talking otherwise. Thank you. Right, so, introducing our esteemed panel, because there's a lot of them, we're going to go really quick. On this end, starting at this end, we have Mr. Dave Ranyard from Dream Reality Interactive. We have Sarah Jones from Coventry University. We have Anthony Hollis from Les Enfants Terribles. I always say that really badly. My French accent just isn't in it. We have Kulhan, who is an exec producer for TV and has been with such esteemed establishments as ITV, BBC, and MTV. We have the lovely Rhianna Pratchett. I need to say no more than the name Rhianna Pratchett. We have the lovely Nick Button-Brown. You do so many things, Nick, I can't think of which thing I should say first. The chair of the BAFTA Games Committee, Improbable, and various other things. And then on the very end, last but not least, in any shape or form, is James Seager, also from Les Enfants Terribles. So, that being said, we love you too, James, we do. That being said. So this is our collection of what we're terming as the VR Writer's Room for this session. And the way this works is that we talk about the original findings of some research that was done back in April of last year. And we look very specifically at 4 key areas, which are audience, world building, narrative, and technology and technique. And we go through these areas looking at the different perspectives from different industries. And so I am going to start. Who am I going to pick on first? I am going to pick on you, Muki.
Is that me?
I'm going to pick on you first. Because I want to talk about audiences.
I haven't said anything yet.
Sorry, in case you didn't realise, we do this a lot, so don't worry about this. But in terms of audiences, and from a 360 film perspective versus a true VR gaming perspective, and when you are writing for these different audiences, I would love to hear some of your thoughts and your insights in regards to some of the experiences you've had. I'm going to name names, and I'm going to say The Voice as a starting point. Why don't you give us a little bit of insight into some of the issues that you faced in terms of identifying and curating for those audiences with the new format of 360?
That's a great question, Tanya. Thanks.
I try.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. This is a very important session for us because Tanya works very, very hard. One more round of applause for Tanya Laird, people. Don't be shy.
We only have half an hour.
Exactly. So in a nutshell, so about a year ago, I was executive producer for digital for The Voice on the BBC, and we produced the BBC's first series of VR clips for any Saturday night television show. We actually shot it and stitched it and did everything about a year and a half ago, knowing it wouldn't be published till about a year later, well, about 6 months later, so a year ago now, 2016. The audiences that we had in mind to kind of quickly shovel to the question, to answer the question, is knowing that the audience for The Voice for the BBC is between age 6 and 66. We were very, very, very careful to try to cater to making sure that the story that we were telling in these clips were very, very simple experiences to bring audience to a place that they can't access. So we had access to the coaches, to will.i.am, Boy George, Ricky, and Paloma at the time. So we wanted to give them experiences that they couldn't actually get, but that will enhance the television show. So they got to go behind the scenes on the photo shoot, actually take a first-person point of view to walk to audition. And the majority of these clips, we knew that we were it's a grand experiment, knowing that the format is quite new. So we wanted to be sure that the 6-year-old can access it, which we found that most 6-year-olds were accessing through our app, through the YouTube, and then also a 66-year-old would use it. So I always say, give it the mom test. So I gave the iPad to my mom, and she could figure it out how to scroll and give that immersive experience. While at the same time, we were catering to like a little bit more of, you know, anyone that does have a headset, they'll have an equally exciting experience, especially with the first-person point of view to audition.
Okay, so just talking on perspectives and kind of following that theme, James, I'm going to throw this one at you, because I think for a lot of people who are in these types of conferences, when we have these types of sessions, one of the things that we don't have enough of is diversity of conversation and other sectors that we bring into that conversation. And so from an immersive theatre perspective, being that you're talking about a performance that is essentially, it's a 360 performance, let's be honest, but there's also an element of game design in what you do. And what I think would be really interesting for this audience is to maybe talk a little bit more about the actual degree of technical requirement within your shows and what you're doing in terms of technology and how you're fusing the technology into what you're doing with immersive theatre.
Okay, so we from Les Enfants Terribles did an immersive show in 2015 in London. Basically, it was an immersive Alice in Wonderland. It was called Alice's Adventures Underground. And at the time, we approached the immersive world not because everyone else was doing it, but everyone else is kind of doing it in the theatre world, but because that was, for us, was the best way to tell Alice in Wonderland. For us, it's not to go to a theatre and sit there and watch a version on stage. It's to actually go to Wonderland. When you read that book, you want to go to Wonderland. When you read Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you want to go to the Chocolate Factory, which is very much what games do as well. So we approached it in a new way, and in a way where we wanted to take the audience to Wonderland, but immerse them and put them at the forefront of the story, of a story. And so to do that, we wanted to give the illusion of free will or free choice to the audience. But actually, it's very, very controlled, this show. It's coming back again this year, and it's going to Shanghai as well. But we have 40 actors, essentially, in the show, and the audience go into Wonderland and choose Eat Me, Drink Me, then get split, and then get split again. So there's 4 groups of 14 that go round Wonderland. 4 groups, because spades, diamonds, clubs, hearts. They go into areas and different rooms, but every single room and area is controlled by time, because this happens during the evening 12 times. So every 15 minutes, another 56 people go in, then another 56, then another 56, and they get divided up. So we had to develop a time code that at the time was the most complicated in the world, because you had 650 people going around this building, the vaults underneath Waterloo Station, and we never wanted each group to meet another group. So the level of technology that we had to develop and design for this time code, in order how it worked, essentially an audience went into a room, and then very simply lights came on, and then 4 minutes 32 seconds the lights dimmed, and then the actor knew, right, that audience have to go on to the next area and next area. Every single room and every single area had to be controlled by time. I mean, that was just a simple version, but we used other elements of, like, maybe something in a sound or something like that, so the actor knew the audience had to move on. So that level of complexity for 650 people, all divided into 14 groups of 14, was very, very complex, and took about 2 months to work out, to make sure that this group didn't bump into that group and blah, 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 blah. So the technology behind it was paramount, and we wouldn't be able to do this show without that technology. Audiences, when they come to see it, don't realise the complexity of creating this show, but we don't really want that. We don't want them to walk around thinking, well, how do they do this? Just to experience Wonderland and experience this show. So technology, we wouldn't be able to do without it, and developing a computer program that would devise this for us.
So it's interesting here that as you're speaking about your show and you're talking about the process, it doesn't sound terribly dissimilar to what we in the games industry might call game design. And I know Dave's chuckling over here, in as much as there are a lot of similarities in that process. And I am curious from your perspective, Dave, as you are planning some of your experiences, because it's a very similar process. What type of techniques or lessons that you think you can take from the immersive theatre industry and apply to what you do?
Well, it's definitely something we've looked at. That we've looked at a number of times in VR, is to talk to people from immersive theatre, because in terms of the stories that you're creating and the sort of journey and the fact that it can be different per person are very, very similar. And I mean, the thing I know from dealing with software and making software are that some things that software can do really well and people can't, and vice versa. So some of the things, I think your challenges are to do with the physical bodies moving around, but equally, if you look at trying to recreate that experience purely from software, where you've got 14 people sharing the experience at one time, the online networking challenge of that would be pretty huge. I mean, people do that, but for example, the matchmaking, and we all know this from game design, matchmaking, syncing, and then knowing exactly what those other 13 people are doing in terms of within that virtual environment would also be quite a challenge, and would probably need similar techniques in terms of your time code, including the fact that some of online will lag. So that would be like an additional layer. But that does, to me, feel quite similar.
And I find that quite interesting in as much as we're talking very much about the technical logistics of being able to execute this. But what we're not talking about is the story element of this. And one of the things that I found most interesting about what Alice was doing was that actually each one of those groups was kind of responsible ultimately for the other audience's experience. So you'd have some people who were in the kitchen stealing the tarts with the Knave of Hearts, and others who were in the behind the kitchen peeking through a hole in the wall, watching and witnessing, so that later when they were in court with the Queen of Hearts, they could actually stand witness against the people who'd stolen the tarts. And so everybody actually had direct responsibility for how other people's stories turned out.
Yeah.
And storytelling-wise, Rhianna, I'm throwing this one at you. I think that there's quite a lot of interesting opportunities for making the audience responsible for other audiences' experiences, and it's something that we're quite used to within the games industry. But I'm curious to hear from you, from your perspective, how you see this mapping out in something like VR, where we have less control over necessarily how people are consuming those chunks of narrative storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of challenges, and I think we're still sort of only scratching the surface of how to deal with them. I mean, something the video games have been doing a lot, and we've particularly experienced, is kind of world building and journey building. So, you know, we use I mean, every entertainment medium uses environmental storytelling to a certain degree, but with video games, and certainly the potential is there with VR, depending on how the players are going to move through the world. The real estate for environmental storytelling in games is huge, because it's not a fleeting scene in a movie or a one-line description in a book. You can get into the environment, you can kind of poke around in it. It's why games like the first BioShock, for example, were so successful and really pushed a resurgence in environmental storytelling. And the games industry is we're used to creating worlds, and we're used to thinking about the player as being the centre of that, and the journey of that individual player through that world. I mean, we have the same sort of challenges creating multiplayer story experiences, and I think something like World of Warcraft, for example, has been very good with that, and the idea of creating kind of phasing storytelling where some players are going to be experiencing or seeing the world slightly differently because of things they haven't and have done. So we're kind of definitely wrestling with the same kind of challenges.
Okay. So, Sarah, I want to bring this back to you in terms of education. And obviously there's a lot that we still need to do to fill the gaps when it comes to evolving these approaches and fusing together things like the immersive theatre approach or the TV and film approach to what the games industry is doing. So things like mosaic storytelling, for example, which is kind of the direction that we're talking about there with Rhianna. I'm curious from your perspective whether or not you think that there are enough universities or enough courses out there that are really addressing this inherent need to either A, retrain or refocus people's existing skill set, or B, train people from the ground up in these new emergent ways of storytelling for VR and for immersive environments.
I'd probably just say no. I don't think there are, and that's probably a really wrong thing to say at the moment, but we're all very much in a bubble where we think everybody is really into this. And I know when I've gone to speaker things and I've had conversations, I'm like, I do stuff in VR, and they say, is that video rendering? And I'm like, seriously, what planet are you living on? This whole world is virtual now. And I don't think there is enough activity. It's getting better, but it's about engaging really early on. So, I mean, my real job, I guess, is across media and performing arts, and I do a lot of work with theatre people. I do a lot of work in the media and the filming and that kind of side of things, and then with engineering and computing as well. So bringing all those disciplines together, and that's what's important. It's from the ground up, making sure that this is a massive collaborative industry where no one discipline can work by itself. We need to learn from theatre, we need to learn from film, we need to learn from games, we need to learn simply from education, and I do creation of educational experiences. And what is that experience? How can I help forensic scientists learn from in a virtual environment? So yeah, at the moment it's still quite limited. It's easy to pigeonhole it and say VR is just for games, and the wider perspective, still people see that. I'm not a gamer, but I work in VR and I create for VR, and it's getting that message out there that it is a real collaborative experience that needs so many different disciplines to come together.
I find this a really interesting point, which is actually when we talk about narrative storytelling for VR, most people immediately assume, oh, we're talking about writing a game, or we're talking about writing a movie for VR. And actually, there are many different verticals who could be utilising VR, but don't understand how to, because they don't understand the context of narrative storytelling in the medium. So I'm throwing this one at you, Nick. Not because I want to pick on you or anything, but just out of interest. Do you see there coming a point further down the line when you see not necessarily just things like the VR group or the games committee or these things happening, but where you see more inclusivity from outside non-entertainment verticals being included in the conversation as it evolves?
Well, yeah, that's kind of the most exciting area right now. I mean, gosh, I've just denigrated the whole of the games industry. Brilliant, great start.
You heard it here first.
I mean, I kind of talk a lot to film and TV people. And, we kind of get together and here's a film VR experience, here's a TV VR experience, here's a game VR experience. And that's all a little dull. Where it gets more exciting is the kind of crossover between them. I love experiential theatre. That's the one I always point film people to as a way to kind of understand how their film content can be experienced in a different way. I love secret cinema. I mean, I know we're not supposed to talk about secret cinema, but...
First of all, a secret cinema.
But that kind of creating that experience, what you're doing, that kind of multiple locations, that engagement that you do, the way film people are used to communicating their stories in specific ways. And they're very, a film person, you're going to be looking at the story, they're going to be presenting that story to the person that's looking at it. A game person is going to be looking at kind of environmental storytelling, things caused by actions. But you get much more interesting things when you start to mix them, when you bring a bit of everything in, and you find a new way to tell a story. I actually think... there are people coming into all of our industries now who don't have the same constraints. And they're the really interesting people because they don't do it in the way it's already been done. They're actually coming up with completely different ways of doing it. And I know it's not going to be me coming up with a new way of doing it. It's going to be somebody like that. But that's kind of cool. I'd like to see what I can do to help them.
Okay. So literally following straight on from that, Anthony... As somebody who is kind of coming into this from a slightly different perspective and an angle, in as much as, for you guys, you've had to kind of piece this stuff together yourselves and figure out how you want to move forward. And I think this is the same for a lot of the immersive theatre industry, in as much as there hasn't been a huge amount of conversation between the immersive theatre industries and, for example, either the VR or the games industries. Knowing what you know now, having done the first round of Alice, what would have been the kind of key question if you had been in the room with somebody from the games industry or the VR industry? That if you could have just said, look, there's got to be a less painful way of doing this, please tell me. What would have been the thing that you would have asked?
Well, I mean, I didn't directly work on Alice myself, but I do know about Alice. I worked on another immersive one just shortly after that. But it comes down to technicality, really. It's a really big point that you don't really think about in theatre so much. You're used to putting a show on the stage and not thinking about having audience members come out of the auditorium onto the stage. It's a thing of keeping those audience members engaged as they interact with your production. I think it's a really kind of fine balance. And as I was saying earlier, it's learning about how far an audience member is willing to go. There are some audience members that will completely reject the idea of what you're telling them to do. I'm sure it's similar in virtual reality and so on. That kind of thing of, is an audience member up for this challenge? Do they want to do that? And if not, how do we get them to do that? Or therefore, how do we target the right people to do it? I think that's a very, very, very fine balance between that and making sure you're keeping it inclusive to everyone that you want to target, without making it so niche that only 25 people are going to want to do it.
Okay. James, anything to add to that?
Well, I guess the other thing is, we are bringing it back this year, and I think it's it's good to see what worked and what didn't work. But I always think sometimes people like press or critics are calling us an immersive theatre company, and we had quite big success with this show, so I think that's why they're saying we are an immersive theatre company. But as a theatre company, we've been going for 15 years, and we've only got into the immersive world in the last 2 years. But it's what I said earlier. It's what can I use? What's the best tool to tell a story? And I think someone said it earlier, but for us, the most important thing is telling a story. It's storytelling. We're a storytelling theatre company. And approaching it again, to answer your question, it's like, well, how best to tell this story? How can I, in this particular area, in the mirror room, for example, can I use a piece of technology or a theatrical device or video film or projection or whatever to drive this story further? For us, the minute that that's reversed, then there's a problem. In other words, to approach saying, well, what cool thing can I do to pigeonhole into a story? That's the wrong way. It's story first, and then think, how can I use this piece of technology or set or whatever to tell the story? And that's the most important thing for us. I think it becomes unbalanced if you approach it in reverse.
Absolutely, I would fully agree with that. Just because I'm aware that we're very short on time and there were so many of you on this stage, I'm going to throw one last question out to all of you, and we'll kind of run down the line real quick. But what I am interested to hear from each of you about is in terms of the other peripheral technologies and techniques that you would be looking at using. I say this on the basis that realistically in this room, if we all work in VR, we know that VR is not a standalone solution. We know that it needs to rest alongside other solutions such as augmented reality, such as artificial intelligence, or haptic design, whatever that thing may be, but it's not a standalone solution. And so I'm curious from each of you in terms of what is that technology, or what is that thing that is of most interest. And I know, for example, Sarah, you might want to talk about smells. I don't know, just saying. But Dave, let's start with you.
Well, I did a PhD in AI.
I know.
So I'm really interested in VR and AI.
I was giving you the chance to talk about AI, come on.
Genuinely, I did have a bit of a tipping point last year. I went to the Web Summit, which is a crazy conference, 50,000 people in Portugal. And even the speaker room has its own set of talks, one of which was some people who'd made this female robot, and I guess it was about this size of talk, and the audience were just asking this female robot questions, and she was answering as best she could, similar to Google Assistant or any other reputable voice recognition system that's on the market. And I sort of realised that those robots are going to cost millions of dollars to make. And so actually, a lot of the realisation of those things will probably happen in VR and AR first, because it will be cheaper, it will be easier, you don't have to worry about the physicality of the emotional face and so on, the rigging and all that. And so I think in the next few years there'll be a really interesting marriage between mixed reality and AI. But
you're talking about the idea of physical AI of an assistant or a person you can interact with.
Somebody, a person, a human-like,
rather than AI
entity.
Controlling,
Yeah, I mean, there could be other AI. There's a lot of interesting AI that could work in VR as well. Yeah. Learning how people work in gaming, for example. There's loads you can do with learning how people play to combat them, or
econometrics and all that.
Yeah, and grabbing stuff. People's play styles and presenting them to other people and that sort of thing. But actually, I'm interested in using narrow bands of knowledge for AI assistance.
Okay, so narrow AI is you, Sarah. Are you going to talk about smells, or are you going to talk about something else?
I'll talk about smells. So for me, making 360 film, we always have that huge issue with getting presence, which is a lot harder within film. So I started adding in lots of smells and other kind of sensory devices, which have really shown, the research we've done has really shown how presence is increased through 360 film when you start adding in heat sensitivities, changes in temperature and changes in the smell to create the full experience. And that for me has been really, really exciting, because it's a way that we can enhance the 360 film aspect, but making that a lot more accessible, which is really difficult to do, and it's really hard to make smells. It's really hard to make smells that kind of are accessible, and you don't need to just adding loads of different things into a device to make it so it's a lot more manageable. But it's learning from kind of the old Sensorama, it's learning from theatre, it's learning from 4D cinema, but applying that within VR, and especially towards 360 film. And the results have been incredible, how much it actually enhances the presence. So that kind of continuation to give 360 film a big shout out.
Okay.
Yeah, picking up on the smell thing, I've done a show before with smells, and it's really interesting because it's sort of goes both ways. You get audience members coming out and going, love the show, and then people go, the smells through the whole show. That scene I could smell this, that scene I could smell that, and you kind of go, well, how can you combine it and make it as uncontrived as possible? You don't want to stick something, like James was saying, you don't want to stick something in because it's a bit of bells and whistles and, you know, it'd be a fun thing to do. You want to have something placed in there. If it were VR, AR, you need to place it within it so it feels like it lives in that environment and you are part of that environment. So it's really getting the sensory aspect. That'd be a really interesting thing, how we harness all of those sensory aspects and put them into a show without making them feel like we've stuck them in as a bonus or as something it adds to the show, but it doesn't feel like it's been added on top, I think. It'd be interesting.
Okay. Muki?
I agree with all of those three. As a producer, I'm looking forward to seeing the advancement of cameras and rigging and making the the production a little bit more simple. For example, you don't need a 35 camera GoPros for every single shoot you might do. You might for certain things, but also the simplicity of the distribution formats and the ways that there are apps being made, and it's going to be a lot more easier to watch it and understand it for whether you are 6 or 66 or brand new to VR, that combines maybe a bit of AI and the senses and the storytelling and 360. But it's also, to go with your answer, I'm looking for non-mechanical, non-technical things, and it's that storytelling and the way people are making those experiences interactive.
Okay.
Thank you.
Rhianna, what about you?
There's a couple of interesting things. I think the evolving of systemic storytelling in the games industry at the moment is very interesting, and that's fairly low tech compared to some of the things the other panelists have talked about. So it means sort of making storytelling work like other systems in a game. So it kind of reacts in a very detailed way to what the player is doing, how they're interacting with other characters, and it's shaped by how the player is playing and how the player is, and it changes, you know, through every playthrough. You're never quite sure what the AI is going to do, and that doesn't involve a lot of. It involves some tech, but it involves a lot of writing, and it involves a lot of kind of working out all the different situations and playthroughs. And obviously, you're sort of dealing with you're creating a lot of content, but how do you make sure that the player sees a lot of it? Ken Levine has a very good talk from a couple of GDCs ago called Narrative Lego, which I encourage people to check out if they're interested in systemic storytelling. And also MoCapture, capturing performance, digital performances. We have sort of embraced it in games, usually in the AAA titles. In Heavenly Sword, which I worked on with Ninja Theory, who have really been at the forefront of MoCapture in games. I think we were the first entertainment product ever to have captured facial and body mocap at the same time, which was Heavenly Sword. And we've seen that, you know, we took on MoCapture for the Tomb Raider games, and they use it a lot in Uncharted. And I think, you know, VR, that whole MoCapture and capturing performance is going to be so important to that. And we're also going to have to look at different ways of writing for that, because suddenly body language and facial expression are going to kind of be in the mix a lot more, and you're kind of we have to learn to write for those. So there's a whole kind of, you know, mess of lots of bits of interesting stuff out there.
Okay, thanks, Rhianna. Nick?
So I've actually changed since the last time we talked about this. I'm now all about the touching.
Ooh, do tell, explain.
I know. So one of the companies I've got involved with is Sensible Objects, and it's a company it's created a physical and digital toy. But the interesting thing that comes out of that, and there's a few people that I saw playing it at Christmas. Yes, Simon, I'm looking at you. The interesting thing that comes from that is how you take that physical digital interaction, how you take that into a VR space and an AR space. And you know, we talk about smells, we talk about the kind of the passive senses, but actually touch is such an active and powerful sense. How do you take your VR world? How do you start interacting with it where you feel it? And you look at haptic suits, you look at the ways of creating that touch sensibility, but there's a lot to be learnt from it because you can really get it horribly wrong. So I think in the next couple of years, it's going to be interesting to see how people use touch to kind of change the experience.
I'd like to see that be more refined as well. So rather than it just being I grabbed that thing, but actually feel the degree of the subtlety.
And it's how you make that a subtle part of the experience and make it so that you're not noticing you're doing it.
Except when you pick it up and smell it.
Well, exactly. So you pick it up, you squeeze it, and then you smell it, definitely.
Okay. And James, final word goes to you.
Well, I guess for us, it's exciting seeing audiences at the moment. I mean, there's been a real huge boom in immersive theatre over the last 2-3 years. Secret Cinema, Punch Drunk, and a lot of people are seeing our stuff as well. And I think that is really interesting to ask why. Hopefully our stuff is good. But the answer to that, I think, is because audiences want it, and audiences are more demanding. And I think this goes across all kind of across sectors of gaming and TV and film and music as well. There's an idea that audiences are quite passive, but actually I disagree with that. Audiences are thirsty. Audiences are leaving the theatre. That's not to say that attendances are down, but they're leaving the theatre because they want to experience something different. And I think there's a real gap and there's a real excitement out there for something that can combine all these disciplines, because at the moment it seems that audiences want that experience.
Wonderful. I've given you absolutely no time to ask questions. I will ask the person at the back, do we have time to take some questions, pretty please? No? I'm being told no. Sorry, folks. You don't get questions. That's the way it works.